Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. We are going to get started, even though we have some folks that are still hopping on. We're going to give some introduction first to what we're hoping to get out of today and do some introduction of our panelists, and then we will go ahead and get started. So thank you all for attending this webinar. We'll be talking about how the core districts advance social emotional learning, measurement, and practice. We're going to be sharing the results of some new and exciting research, and also have a number of educators and practitioners here on the phone to share with us lessons from their own sites and work and some reflections on the things that we share with you all today. So just a quick plug, we have a lot of new work out that is some very recent as of yesterday and some a little bit older as of a month that we'll be sharing in today's webinar. You can access all of these materials at the link that's down here, the Core PACE Research Partnership. That's also posted in the chat box. So you can go ahead and link on that to download or access all of the research materials that we'll be talking about today. We won't be able to go as in depth as we obviously do in the papers. So if something piques your interest, please feel free to go down and take a look. So today what we're going to be talking about is social and emotional learning. And this is a really big bucket of work that we're engaged in the core districts. There are two primary questions that often come up in this work. The questions are, what is SEL and how do the core districts work to support it? And how does core measure SEL, and are the measures valid and reliable? And there's a lot of sub-questions that are packed into these buckets, but these are the two areas that we'll be covering today in our webinar. We'll bring to bear new research and also lots of practitioner voices into the work. Our agenda for today is that we're first going to have Noah Bookman from the core districts talk about core and core's measurement of SEL and why they chose to measure SEL and how they're currently working together. Taylor Albright from the University of Southern California will share results from a qualitative study where we went into schools in each of the core districts who were having extraordinarily high SEL reports for their students, particularly African American students and Hispanic Latino students, and found out what they did, how they defined social emotional learning, and how they were working to advance it. Then we'll have two folks from within the core districts, Olabayo Allen Taylor from Claremont Middle School and Susan Ward Roncalli from Los Angeles Unified School District, talk about how they work to advance SEL at a school site and at the district level. Then I'll present some results from our most recent quantitative work, a summary paper specifically that tracks social emotional learning and all the work we've done thus far and aggregates the evidence that we have for validity. And then we'll turn it over to Barbara Richardson from San Bernardino Unified and Christine Olmsted from the Orange County Department of Education to provide reflections on what this means at their site and how they're thinking about integrating both measurement and the ideas from this research and what we hear today into their own work. And then we'll open it up for a question and answer period with the audience. And you can feel free to type your questions into the chat box as we go along so that we can, at the end, kind of wrap all of that up together. So without further ado, I will hand it off to you, Noah.
Great, thanks so much, Heather. We're so excited to be online with everybody today. So as many of you are aware, the core districts is a collaborative. We've been working together since 2010. There are 8 full member districts of core, serving a little over 1 million kids every day in California public schools at 1,600 schools and with over 50,000 teachers. And the districts are posted on the screen here. Next slide. Just to give you a little sense of kind of the history of core, we started working together in 2010, and the base idea for core was that professional learning communities are good for teachers and schools with principals and site leaders. Why aren't they also good for district leaders? And so district leaders in the areas of curriculum instruction, as well as in human capital, began collaborating together across the core districts. Importantly, that also served as an opportunity to build relationships. The other professional learning community that's maintained throughout core has been that professional learning community of our board, which are the superintendent of the core districts. From 2013 to 2016, CORE received an ESEA waiver, which meant that instead of doing No Child Left Behind, the CORE districts were implementing their own approach to measuring and improving school quality. And that's where we really launched this effort around whole school, whole child approach to both measuring schools and improving schools with a strong emphasis on equity. In our current work, we continue to leverage both all three areas around equity, as well as analytics using our core data system, our core data collaborative, and then this effort around continuous improvement that started with things like school pairing and communities of practice in the waiver era, and have now evolved into our first networked improvement community focused on math. Next slide. So our school quality improvement system, our measurement system that the districts you see on the you'll see today are participating in, and other districts around the state of California are participating in, includes a combination of essentially replicating the state measures and trying to do that in as timely a way as possible for our districts, looking at things like distance to mean standards, English learner progress, and chronic absence, and the others you see here. And then we have some of what we call CORE's locally driven measures. These are indicators that CORE provides to our 8-member districts and the members of our core data collaborative that go above and beyond the state measures that include an academic growth indicator, the social emotional factors we'll talk about today, measures of culture and climate via survey in terms of student, family, and staff survey, and a high school readiness measure that looks at the percentage of 8th graders that are highly likely to graduate on time from high school. Under development is an area of focus around college and career readiness. We've just launched an effort to really understand what's happening to our kids after they leave us and what predicts that. And that's an area of work for the coming school year. But as I mentioned, the CORE not only includes our 8 core member districts, but we've also opened up our data system to others who want to join through our core data collaborative. San Bernardino City is on the call today. Barbara Richardson was one of our founding members of the core data collaborative. We serve almost 2 million kids through that system across the state of California. Next slide. So one of the things that CORE had the opportunity to play a leadership role in our country is this issue of measuring social emotional factors. And the base idea underlying this effort is that if, and which is true to us, that social emotional factors or non-cognitive factors are as important, if not more important, than some of the academic skills, you actually need both, then they should show up in our measurement systems, and they should show up right next to things like English and math. And so that's why we launched this effort and have engaged in what we think is the largest ever effort to measure social emotional factors. And that measurement effort is growing through our data collaborative and through our partners. Next slide. And just to emphasize, why does SEL matter? This is a graph that might look a little bit complicated, but I think the point is to look at this red triangle, the red box at the top. And essentially what James Heckman found in his research is that having cognitive skills is not enough. Having non-cognitive skills is not enough. You really need both. And this is looking at the probability of graduating college by the age of 30. Graduating from a 4-year college. And what we find is that top spot there, that red box, these are the kids with the strongest cognitive and non-cognitive factors. Those are the ones who are like almost definitely going to graduate. And we see that on the bottom right and on the bottom left, if you're really strong in cognitive or really strong in non-cognitive, that is not enough if you're weak in the other area. Kids need both. They need cognitive and non-cognitive factors to be successful in school and in life. Next slide. So that's what compelled us to start looking at these factors. We went through a process of narrowing down a set of skills or mindsets, dispositions that we could all agree on as a set of core districts that are measurable, meaning that we have a good way to measure them, malleable, meaning that we have evidence that schools can actually impact and influence these things, and meaningful, meaning that we have research that suggests that these things predict whether or not you'll be successful in school and in life. We intentionally at CORE did not put together an all-in framework for what is social emotional learning. We honor the different frameworks that are out there, like Castle's framework, which I'll show you a slide on in a second. And instead sort of said as a set of collaborative districts, we can agree that these are 4 that are worth focusing on: growth mindset, self-efficacy, self-management, and social awareness. Next. One of the things that we did find valuable in looking at these 4 skills is that they spread the gamut between intrapersonal, things that happen within ourselves, and interpersonal skills. Mindsets and efficacy are things that happen in ourselves. Self-management has both intra and interpersonal aspects to it, and social awareness is an interpersonal skill. Next. As I mentioned, many districts, and we think it's fantastic, we're great partners with CASEL, that's the Collaborative for Academic and Social Emotional Learning. We enjoy working with them closely on a number of efforts. They do have a framework for social emotional learning, which many districts find valuable, and if it works for your district, we think that's fantastic. They focus on 5 areas: self-management, self-awareness, responsible decision-making, relationship skills, and social awareness. Our skills that we measure map onto those pretty nicely, directly with self-management and social awareness. And then self-awareness, mindsets and self-efficacy can be thought of as things that are a part of our self-awareness. Next. Click one more time, that'd be great, thanks. Or a couple more times. I had more animation in the slide than I realized. Oh, there we go. So CORE has launched our first networked improvement community, leveraging the method and approach of the Carnegie Foundation. And we, as a set of districts, the 8 core member districts, are initially focusing on this issue of closing math achievement gaps for our African American and Latinx students over the next few years. And I'll also mention that in addition to this improvement community, we're launching another improvement community next year, utilizing a method called the Breakthrough Series that was developed by the Institutes for Healthcare Improvement. Both of these are examples of continuous improvement using improvement science. Want to go to the next slide? Part of what is important, though, is that if we're trying to address math, social emotional factors are certainly a key driver of what's going on with math. There's a little bit going on the screen, but I'm going to try to walk you through it. So this is an example of something that we looked at when we were doing our root cause analysis around math. What you'll see is each district got this report of how your district is doing and other districts are doing with respect to math, going from left to right, low achieving on the left, higher achieving on the right, breaking it down by racial groups, and then by different, in this case, groups of self-efficacy. And what we find is that, like, if we're looking at African Americans at the top row here, that students with lower self-efficacy do more poorly in math if you're African American. They do more poorly in math if you're Latino. They do more poorly in math if you are white. Note, though, that low self-efficacy white kids do as well as high self-efficacy Hispanic Latino kids. So there's still a racial factor underlying these achievement gaps. But what we find in these kinds of graphs is that self-efficacy and other social emotional factors do have an underlying impact and influence on math. And many of the interventions or change ideas that our teams are attempting, if we go to the next slide, actually, this kind of shows this, in our improvement work. We at CORE are working with district and local improvement teams to implement change ideas related to math. And many of those change ideas have a social emotional factor to them. So for instance, work going on to improve the sense that kids feel connected to their math improves their self-efficacy. So things that are designed to make the math more relevant to students' lives are directly about trying to create that sense of efficacy, like this math stuff really matters for me, and doing well in it is good and helpful to my life. So very much a part of our improvement work as well. And I think that is it. I'm looking forward to hearing more through the webinar, but I think that gives hopefully folks a sense of why we at CORE focus on social emotional factors and how it plays now an increasing role as we delve into trying to improve things like math outcomes for our youth.
Thank you so much, Noah. So it's in the context of all of this work that Noah laid out that the CORE PACE partnership evolved and is continuing to evolve to support the needs of the network and all of the districts in it. And our research agenda, all of the work we do, really has two masters. The first is helping to inform continuous improvement within the districts and within the network. But the other is contributing learning to the field so that we can help to improve policy and practice more broadly. And as policy analysis for California education, California is a real target for us. So part of what we aim to do is to share lessons learned, tools and resources, best practices, and original research that's unique to CORE, that with data that's unique to CORE, so that we can help other people accelerate their learning. We do this through a combination of quantitative and qualitative analysis, and you'll be seeing both on the webinar today. The quantitative work helps us to uncover patterns in data, to explore variation, to analyze outcomes, to validate measures. But the qualitative analysis is where we really get to do a deep dive to understand implementation, to highlight promising practices, and to explain some of the variation that we see. And so without any further ado, I'm going to hand it off to Taylor Albright, who's part of a large network of researchers that we work with to execute our research agenda. Taylor's at the University of Southern California, but as you can see here, we work with researchers across the state and across the country to really leverage some of the best and brightest in helping to share these lessons and accelerate improvements in policy and practice. So Taylor will answer the question, what is SEL and how do the core districts work to support it?
Thank you, Heather. Good morning, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here. Like Heather said, I'm going to be talking about our qualitative study titled Enacting Social Emotional Learning, in which we looked at practices employed within core districts and schools. This was part of a team effort. So the other team members on this project were Julie Marsh, Susan McKibben, Heather, Michelle Hall, Ananya Metuos, and Caetano Sequeira. We were driven by 3 research questions here. So first we asked, how do educators define social emotional learning? And then second, what are the strategies used at the school level to support these various conceptions of SEL? And what were the strategies used at the district level? And to give a little bit of context, as Noah already addressed, this study was emerging out of efforts to accelerate math achievement among African American and Latinx students in grades 4 through 8. So our particular focus was on middle school students in these 2 racial groups. And we were particularly interested in how schools and districts were enacting SEL in support of these target students. So the methods that we employed, this was a positive outlier study, meaning we looked at schools that were outperforming other schools with similar levels of demographics and resources. And by outperforming, we were looking at the core SEL surveys, so students self-report of those 4 SEL categories that Noah described. We selected 2 schools within 5 core districts, and we selected schools that served large proportions of African American and or Latinx youth. And those youth were top quartile in those SEL self-reports in both 2015 and 2016. We also selected schools with relatively high math performance. We conducted a number of interviews, a total of 71 interviews across these 10 schools and their districts. We also observed classes, lunch periods, various activities at the schools, and analyzed relevant documents and artifacts. Some quick caveats to note. So as a qualitative and exploratory study, our aim was to understand how educators defined their SEL success. We weren't making causal claims that a particular practice was causing particular outcomes, but we were trying to identify what are the practices currently at play in these schools with some evidence of high SEL performance. So in response to this first question, how do educators define social emotional learning? The answer, next slide, is there was wide variance in how SEL was conceptualized. We grouped these various definitions that we heard into 6 overarching categories. So some folks talked about supporting student mental and emotional well-being. Others were talking about creating a safe and supportive school climate. We also heard that SEL means developing social skills and behaving appropriately. We heard that SEL could be supporting adolescent development, particularly in the challenging context of middle school. Or SEL means building a culture of inclusion, accepting difference and diversity, or that SEL is addressing the needs of the whole child. So something to note here is these various conceptions are getting at Both sort of the SEL competencies that Noah was talking about, the sort of non-cognitive factors at the individual level, but we're also hearing environmental level factors, like at the school environment, and also hearing things relating to mental health, like depression, anxiety, and other types of mental health concerns. And one question that this brings up is, if SEL is defined in so many different ways, when an organization like a school or district is attempting to support students' SEL, is it possible that maybe people are talking about different things, and could that create challenges for implementation of support? So next slide. So the next question that we look at is, what are the strategies employed at the school level to support these various conceptions of SEL? And these categories, these strategies fell into 6 categories. So first, we heard about promoting positive climate and relationships. Some of the examples of strategies here would be a whole school culture building strategy. Like some of the schools we visited took just the first 2 weeks that were focused on building school culture. Each class would have sort of a different aspect of school norms, culture, values that they were focusing on in these initial weeks. Another example would be leveraging advisory periods as a place for building positive relationships among students, between the teacher and students, discussing issues that were going on campus. Or perhaps organizing schedules and students in a way that supported relationships. So some schools would loop students with the same teacher over multiple years, or have students organized in like families or cohorts to build relationships in a smaller group. Another category is supporting positive behavior. So these were reforms changing the way we talk about discipline to move away from a more punitive focus to one that is focused on supporting students' skill development around behavior, or restoring harm that may be caused by forms of misbehavior. This often includes establishing clear values and expectations, or targeted approaches like multi-tiered systems of support. If you could click. We have a quote speaking to these positive behavior approaches. So one school administrator told us, instead of looking at a for everything and also having a blanket zero tolerance policy, we have more case-by-case responses to students. That's what we do with restorative practice, to sort of disrupt our punitive ways that we were used to going about responding to discipline. Next category was the use of elective courses and extracurricular activities to intentionally promote SEL. Some schools would use a course like music or PE that was focused around developing communication skills or building relationships in the context of that elective. We saw student clubs, like kindness clubs, that were specifically focused on spreading kindness throughout the campus. A fourth category, classroom practices and curricula, were at the teacher level practices intended to promote SEL. So for example, some teachers were using group seating very intentionally to build students' social awareness and behavior skills. Or teachers might model a growth mindset for the class in the way that they communicated and guide students in using growth mindset oriented language. An example of that is in this next quote. One math teacher talked about how they used mistakes as an opportunity to instruct around growth mindset. This math teacher said, so we really put an emphasis on how making mistakes is the only way we can learn. How mistakes are really put in this special place where we applaud them, look at them. So we go through all of that to talk about how these things make your brain grow. And every so often throughout the year, we will pick our favorite mistakes and have the students do error analysis on those mistakes. A fifth category was hiring, organizing, and training personnel to support SEL. So for example, we saw staff leadership teams focus specifically on campus climate, or leveraging non-instructional staff to provide particular SEL support, such as managing a cool down or restorative room for students who are experiencing emotional intensity. Or we would hear opportunities for adults to learn about SEL, such as through professional development focused on a particular aspect of social emotional learning. And in a sixth category was the use of data to support SEL. So in some places, this was the core survey data. And in other places, we also saw examples of school or staff-led data collection efforts, such as a short Google form that was used to ask students about how they were feeling about friendships and relationships on campus and things like that. Some common themes that emerged across these outlier schools, these schools built on their existing assets. So they would take an existing strength, such as a strong sports program or a music program, and then utilize that as a vehicle for promoting SEL. So they were taking strengths that they already had and building upon them. Another thing that these outlier schools did was intentional implementation. So rather than sort of a hodgepodge of various initiatives, we saw deliberate structures around staff roles, around various trainings and expectations throughout the school, and how staffing was invested in their overall support for students. And then a third theme was an emphasis on student agency and leadership. Many of these schools were using youth-led efforts to support SEL, such as the kindness clubs that we mentioned, or student-led lessons on SEL, say in advisory. Some schools had buddy programs, like a buddy program between gen ed and special ed students to support inclusion on the campus. And then our third research question, how do districts support SEL practices? We saw 5 categories of support here. One would be establishing priorities and frameworks, such as a set of SEL standards across the district. Staffing at the district level, some districts had staff particularly focused around campus climate or SEL issues. Districts might purchase programs or curricula intended to support various conceptions of SEL and offer training, professional development at the district level. And then finally, we also saw data use at the district level of, say, core district surveys or other measurements, such as various surveys and inventories associated with the different programs they were implementing around SEL. And so to wrap up, we do offer a few implications that we thought our findings suggest for policy and practice. One implication, going back to our finding that there were multiple and varied SEL conceptions, we suggest it may be important to build common understandings and alignment regarding SEL within schools and districts. We recognize that this conception could be quite broad and holistic, but we suggest it could be beneficial for there to be clarity in what we're talking about when we're talking about supporting students in their social emotional development. Next, you'll remember that this research was prompted by a question around addressing math achievement and accelerating math achievement among African American and Latinx middle school students in math. And we saw in our findings that the connections between SEL and racial equity or achievement gaps, and the connection between SEL and specific academic contact areas such as math, were not very clear. We did not hear much of an understanding of that connection. We suggest that if SEL is intended as a lever to address racial math achievement gaps, that connection could be made more explicit and a stronger theory of change could be developed in this area. And then finally, we note that there are a broad range of SEL strategies in our findings, and we suggest that this range indicates that possibly SEL is not about a single solution, but a broader collection of approaches. And we would suggest it's important to consider this full range in thinking about how to support students socially and emotionally. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Taylor. Now we're going to hand it off to Olabayo Allen Taylor, who's at Claremont Middle School, to give us some examples of how this work plays out in her setting.
Hi, everyone. My name is Olabayo Allen Taylor. I've been at Claremont for 5 years, and I'm the community schools manager, as well as the Dean of Culture and Climate. Actually, next year, I'll be taking a principal role at an elementary school in East Oakland. So time is up for my time at Claremont, but the work is still embedded into our culture. A little bit about our school: we have about 450 students, and we have about a third of those students are African American, a third are white, and a third are between Filipino and Latinx. And so, and when we think about where our students have come from over time, I would say about 4 years ago, less than 20% of our students came from our neighborhood schools, and now we're at about 50%. And so those students really, I think it resonated with the community that our school was now a safe place to go to. And so instead of opting to go to a private school, our students are now opting to go to their neighborhood public school. And I think that is very important. It speaks volumes to the type of work we're doing with social emotional learning at our school. We also have had very consistent leadership over the past 4 years. This school at one point had 5 principals in one school year and had really been in a lot of trouble around trying to get consistent focus And so we did a lot of work around just building those systems and structures that will last beyond the leadership that stands in front of our students all the time. Another piece about how really we define SEL, I think there's so many broad terms, and I think this study really speaks to the variation in how we define it, but simply we define it as supporting the mental and emotional well-being of our students. And we utilize student or positive culture and climate as an avenue for creating that space and strategies to address and sort of support students in their building their emotional and mental capacity. I think 3 key things that we really focused on this when we were working around our social emotional learning and building that positive school climate was creating like a real shared vision that was embedded in SEL. I think as educators, we kind of get inundated with all of these acronyms that sometimes taking the acronym out and focusing on the outcome that we want to have in schools becomes a better focus and is more well received amongst educators. So we embedded a lot of SEL into our vision and mission, but we focused on how do we set the conditions in our environment and create every student touch point at our school to speak to creating a safer space for those students to develop themselves mentally and emotionally. And so one main thing that we did was implement PBIS. I think PBIS became this real focus on defining the behaviors that we wanted to see in certain areas of the school. And if you work in middle school, the 2 main areas of concern for students is the bathroom and also the locker room. And so by having these shared expectations around how you're supposed to be in these areas, it kind of lowered the anxiety of those students walking into those spaces, that they were comfortable knowing that there was an expectation and that we were going to, really reinforce those expectations for all of our students in these spaces. So it really opened up that opportunity for students to kind of get rid of the ambiguity on how am I going to be? How should I look? How should I do things? So that they're not relying on their own selves to kind of come up with how they should be, that it's really a shared understanding of those things. I also think that we were very intentional about data collection around this and really thinking about saying, hey, we're doing this work, but are we really doing this work? So we do a climate check survey every month where we're really asking students to say, do you feel emotionally safe to share your opinion at school? Do you feel emotionally safe to be in certain groups? Do you feel like you can walk at any part of the school and be accepted? And they can tell us, and then they also can write back and say, well, this is the area I don't feel comfortable in the cafeteria, or I don't feel comfortable in this setting or being by this group. And we really are intentional about beefing up those supports and responses to support those students in real time to kind of really help and address those issues. We also do a lot on student leadership. It's really difficult sometimes to help students step into their leadership and be comfortable to advocate for themselves and to advocate for their classmates. So we really try to pull in those students that really don't want to be in leadership, but that really need those opportunities to kind of grow into themselves and get comfortable with that interaction. And so we have at least 4 or 5 different groups that students can lead in. And our main 3 are our kindness ambassadors that actually put on the work in helping our students spread kindness across the campus. We also have our student council, which really, they take the lead on a lot. They are involved in a lot of the decision making that we do around things that affect or have an impact on students. And we also do a lot on restorative justice. So our students actually resolve their own conflicts on their own instead of coming to adults and having that shame or feeling a little bit uncomfortable that we're in their business. They go to each other and they actually start to solve those conflicts. And we believe that is that work of, building that capacity around like, I can advocate for myself, I can share, and I can also solve these problems. And that conflict isn't really all that bad. It's just how we deal with it that makes it, the greatest thing. It's like, it's how we deal with and how we respond to it, not that we're in it. And then we also have a lot of our staff really trained and focused in on SEL. Because it's in our vision and mission, you can't opt out. So every aspect of our school has to really be gearing towards looking at how do we live out our vision and mission, and so that there is no opt-out option. And so it's a part of our PD, it's embedded in our culture, and so that it's really a part of what we're doing as a school. I don't know what other questions there were, but that was pretty much what we do. Heather, did you have any questions or specific things that I can speak to?
No, I think that was a really great overview, Ola. Thank you so much. And for those of you that are on the webinar, please put any questions that you have into the question and answer box for her about how they develop these strategies at Claremont Middle School and what some of the effects are, anything that is rising to the top for you. And we'll bring that up at in the conversation period at the end. So thank you so much. We're going to move on now to talk about how this work is playing out in LAUSD. And for this, I will share slides. Susan Ward Roncalli from LAUSD will speak to the strategies that they're using at the district level in that district. Susan?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so let's go on to the next slide. So this is me. I'm Susan Ward Roncalli, and I was in the classroom for 30 years, but now I am a social emotional learning facilitator. Our unit works through health education, but we are in the division of instruction, which I think is important for our work because we like to look at SEL as an instructional practice as part of our instructional day. Can you go on? So an overview of the district, we have about 618,000 students, almost 1,000 schools. Our district is pretty large. It's over 710 square miles. This is important for me because 2 of the schools that I serve are at opposite ends of the district, which means they're 75 miles apart. LA Unified has a large percentage of English learners, and we have a pretty mixed population, as you can see on the slide. Other issues that we're dealing with are over 4,000 foster youth. Almost 500,000 of our students are eligible for free or reduced lunch. And since we partner with school mental health, we're looking a lot at trauma. And our school mental health director has done several different projects around trying to figure out what is the level of trauma in LAUSD. So one of those mini screenings was of 572. These were 5th graders, and 88% of those 5th graders reported 3 or more traumatic events in their lifetime. And of those students that reported 3 or more, 55% of those showed symptoms of PTSD, depression, or anxiety. So when we're looking at SEL, we're also looking at how can we perhaps use SEL to teach students who have experienced trauma how to manage their emotions. LA Unified is interesting in our definition of SEL. This is the Castle definition, but in meetings with various departments, I've discerned that not everybody shares this definition. This is the one that's on our webpage, and we are the SEL facilitators for the district, but because it's so huge and because SEL is just a force of nature unto itself these days, a lot of different departments and areas have developed their own definitions, and they're just moving forward with their own PD. So through the work that we're doing with MTSS, we're trying to get a handle on that and make sure that we do sort of step back and develop a common definition that everybody agrees on. So this is the way it works for LAUSD. We have 6 SEL facilitators. We work with 73 schools that were these were core waiver schools. There were more schools initially, but as schools have been going through WASC or schools have been impacted by some of our reporting requirements, some of them did drop out. Each school that we serve has a team of 3 to 5 teachers or out of classroom staff. These teachers can earn up to 40 hours of their pay at their regular rate for work on developing and implementing a school plan for social emotional learning. This team uses data to develop an SEL implementation plan for the year. And I'll be glad to share what that plan looks like if anyone wants more details. Our team works with each site, and they take their data And we were very lucky a few years ago to have disaggregated data so they could really target their work. We do have most of the schools using the LAUSD School Experience Survey data points, which are directly through CORE, so thank you, CORE. Some of the schools are working with an SEL rubric that I developed with Transforming Education, and I'll also be glad to share that. The people at Research and Reporting in LAUSD have recently updated how we're displaying the data from the School Experience Survey, which is wonderful. And I think it's going to make it a lot more accessible, and it means that a lot more people will be looking at it. One of the things that I did with the data this year is I presented to our students, our ASB leaders in our different local districts, and showed them how to navigate the School Experience Survey data and utilize that data in order to ask for funding for certain things from their school site councils. So when the team gets together, they look at their data and they write summative and formative SMART goals. We put the E on the SMART goals because we wanted them to focus on issues of equity. They decide which of the 4 constructs they want to concentrate on. They set really specific goals. You know, some of them started off by saying, oh, we're going to grow everything 20%. And we said, well, wait a minute, let's think about this. So we have them to what we think are meaningful and we think are attainable goals. And we ask them to measure their growth towards their goals twice during the year. They send us this formative data, and then we go out to the schools and meet with the team and discuss it. And I'm sorry, we can go to the next slide. So these school site implementation plans are living documents. So when I go to meet with a school, if it looks like what they're doing is not doing what they intended, then we just revise the plan. So we revise the plan based on the formative data. One strategy that seems to work really well, because as I've said before, it's such a huge district, is I work primarily with high schools. So I have 15 high schools across the district. And in the middle of the year, I had these high schools come together in 2 very large meetings. And I broke them up into groups where they were not with their same schools. And they talked about promising practices, things that were going really well. And then we did a protocol that went over what things they were having difficulty with in terms of achieving their plan. And they overwhelmingly preferred talking about the problem of practice and how they could help each other with ideas from different perspectives to improve that practice. So they also were able to share their resources that they had developed across the district by having these cross-school conversations. Our culminating activity this year was a social emotional learning conference, which was last Thursday, which might be why my voice is a little gravelly today. Our conference, we served over 400 people attended, and we had 40 different workshops going on. And one of the other things that we do is we ask every school that worked with us to create a display of their work for the year, wherein they gave us their goal and they gave us certain activities that they thought were really interesting. They did pictures and graphics on those activities to show us how they worked to achieve their goal. In terms of policy, there's some policy pieces that are really helpful. I don't think we're quite there yet with all of LAUSD doing the same thing and doing it to the same degree of efficacy, but we're trying. Last year, there was a board resolution in support of social emotional learning, resulted in a board informative, which where we were able to give some ideas about things that we thought would work well. The other thing that is helping us is with Christine's work, we're doing the work with the SUMS MTSS, which is gathering our resources so that we can come up with these common definitions. Another piece that's not exactly policy, but helpful is that the single plan for student achievement through the Title I office, because they are very supportive of SEL, they've written that into the plan so that every school that's writing their SPSA has to include what they're going to do to address SEL. So that's making those schools reach out to us to get more support and more resources. And another piece that's going well is that I'm sitting on a team that's revising the district's discipline foundation policy, and we're adapting the language so that it is more trauma-informed and SEL-friendly. Three things that worked really well this year in terms of my district-wide work were collaborations. One was with the group, which is the Academic English Mastery Program. This is a part of our district that works on focusing on support for standard English learners. And we did a lot of work developing PD and working with schools, focusing directly on integrating SEL with culturally and linguistically proficient pedagogy. We did a huge PD with 85 teachers and worked with those teachers so that they each developed a lesson plan or a unit of study that incorporated SEL and standard English learner practices into the unit. Another collaboration is with school mental health, where we're integrating SEL and trauma-informed healing practices. So we're looking at how do we make sure that our teachers understand that some of our students have experienced trauma, and how SEL, while it's not the answer, it's a way to help those students, as I said earlier, learn to manage their behavior, manage their emotions, deal with their anger, so that they can then be ready to learn. Another area of focus for our collaboration is with the performing and visual arts teachers. I've been working with them on their festivals, and I've been going and meeting with groups of teachers specific to dance or specific to drama, focusing on integrating SEL directly into their instruction, so that as those teachers are talking about performance, they are incorporating language of growth mindset, incorporating language of self-efficacy and self-management into the actual lessons. So my reflections when I looked at the reports that PACE Corps put out, the brief validated a lot of what I observe at school sites, that adult interactions are very important. Students really are watching what happens adult to adult. And I also really like the schedule to meet the SEL needs of students. Schools that have advisories or schools that focus on allowing that time and space for students to have that reflection and build those relationships are the schools where I see SEL working really well. Is there anything else you'd like me to address, Heather?
No, thank you, Susan. That's super helpful. And for all of you that are on the webinar today, listening and following along, please put your questions into the question and answer box, because I'm sure you have follow-ups for our speakers so far, and we'll have follow-ups for our speakers still to come. So make sure you put your questions in there. We're going to move on now to talk about measurement. So we've gone really deep into what SEL looks like and why schools and districts are working on implementing it. But we've also heard from all of our speakers a focus on measurement, that core measures, and also there are measures that are local and within these districts that are designed to advance social emotional learning. And so here's where we're going to address this question about how core measures SEL and whether the measures are valid and reliable. But this question, are the measures validated? It's a question that we get a lot. And in the research community, it's not a question that's super easy to answer, because validity is a process. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what that looks like through a paper that I wrote with a colleague, Hunter Gelbach, at the University of Santa Barbara, that lays out a pragmatic approach to validity and reliability using the core surveys. And this is a summary document that covers all of the work that we've done thus far around social emotional learning. So it includes the qualitative work and the quantitative work, and really digs into specifically a set of reports that was just released yesterday. So three working papers and 2 briefs. And it's a big team effort. So I just want to say that colleagues at Harvard, Marty West, colleagues at Education Analytics, Rob Meyer, Andrew Rice, Libby Pierre, Michael Christian, and then colleagues at Stanford University, including Susanna Loeb and Hans Frick and Joe Whitty, really helped to pull all of this together. So first, what I'm going to do is provide some inspiration for this conversation. Validity is a journey. It's not a destination. And so it's not necessarily that you start with, that you're working on measures, you're developing use and research, and then they're validated. More, you're accumulating evidence as you go along that helps you understand to what extent these measures are valid and reliable. What we're going to do in laying this out for you is to provide a pragmatic approach to thinking about validity. Because as we found in our research, and I think will resonate with many of you on the line, there are many tensions in the work that aren't just about validity, but are also about practicality. So the most valid instrument is going to be one that takes 5 days to implement and has thousands of items. That obviously isn't what we're going to do to measure social emotional learning. So where can we identify some of those trade-offs and optimize given the various constraints in our system? So what I'm going to do first is lay out for you a framework for how to think about validity and how to think about the aspects of validity. And then we're going to take each of these and reflect on the evidence that we have thus far with the core surveys and areas where we still have outstanding questions. And then I'm going to wrap up with some reflection questions for people who are considering implementing social emotional learning measurement or who are currently implementing SEL measurement and want to do it more intentionally or want to improve the implementation. So the first question, we have 4 broad questions and with a number of subconstructs in here. So the first question in our validity framework is, how well were the measures designed? And the aspects of validity that we attend to are reliability. We want to know, does the scale produce consistent scores over time when no changes have actually occurred? Do the items within a scale reliably aggregate to one construct? Content validity. Is this actually what we want it to be? When we say that the scale is growth mindset, are we actually measuring growth mindset with the questions that we ask? Do the items have face validity? Meaning when we show these items to a teacher, will she say, yes, this indicates that what I think of as growth mindset? Or do they have structural validity? This is more of a measurement type question, but it really gets at, do the items that were designed in this scale suggest that they actually psychometrically are measuring the thing that they say they're measuring? Is it measuring just one construct versus multiple constructs? Are the items within the scale representative of that construct? So here we might be concerned that, that you say you're measuring growth mindset, but you only measure one piece of growth mindset, not all the pieces. And best practices. To what extent were the survey items written in a way that adhere to best practices in survey design as a way to minimize measurement error? The second bucket of questions is around how well the measures fit the context. And so the kinds of things we want to know here are, do the measures have floor or ceiling effects? So you could imagine a school where all of the students have very high SEL. Is the measure as good at understanding their performance on the measures as it is schools where all of the students are low on SEL? So we really want to be able to understand that full spectrum. Is there reference bias in the items? So in a school where all the students have high SEL, are they, though, looking at each other and saying, well, I think that I used to think I have a growth mindset, but everyone else around me seems to have more of a growth mindset, so I must have a low growth mindset. That would be something that would be problematic for our measurement, because then it would get in the way of understanding school performance, which is why these SEL instruments were introduced in the core districts. And is there measurement invariance? So this is just a really fancy way of saying, do respondents in different groups, do they read the same thing when they read the survey? This is where we might have threats to validity around cultural bias. We really need to understand that that's not happening in order to compare students in different subgroups or how schools are doing with different subgroups. The next bucket is with what level of fidelity were the data acquired. And this is really that a measure can't be valid if the ways that the data were collected are invalid. And so here we have questions around survey administration practices. Did the survey administration motivate students to answer each item to the best of their abilities? We would have threats to validity here if there was cheating encouraged, or if teachers said, remember, 5 is what we want to get on all of these things. We also would have threats to validity if students were satisficing. So if students were, let's say, redlining, answering B, 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 B for all of the answers, or answering mischievously. There's a lot of research out now about mischievous survey respondents where they know that what the bad answer is, I never think that I could succeed if I don't do well right away. And so they just kind of answer very strategically on the survey the most extreme option to be mischievous in that way. Another threat here is social desirability bias, that you say, I don't actually feel efficacious, but I know I'm supposed to say that I feel efficacious, so I'm going to say I feel efficacious. And that would invalidate our survey responses. The fourth bucket is around use, that ultimately these SEL measures are being collected so that they are useful to practitioners, to teachers, to school leaders, and to district leaders. And so there's a lot of questions here about how the measurement creation and analysis and the use is actually effective. So the first bucket here is around analysis and measurement creation. And this is about what we know about how these measures function, how we can scale them or create measures that can be communicated to different audiences, and whether or not these are good and valid ways to report the data. Another area here is around convergent and discriminant validity. And here, this is where we would want to know that the SEL measures correlate with other related measures. If something is not supposed to be related to SEL, then it should not be correlated with the measures. Relatedly, the measures should have predictive validity, meaning that if we believe that SEL is related to academic outcomes, or we hypothesize that it is, then we should be able to see that the SEL measures are related to those academic outcomes. The measures should be generalizable, or this is a question in terms of thinking about validity. When we test a measure in a particular context, can it be generalized to a different context? And finally, consequential validity. When a new measurement is introduced, what are the intended and unintended consequences of the use of the survey scores, either in a school measurement system or otherwise? So now I'm going to walk through each of these questions and provide you with the evidence that we have and the evidence that we don't have for CORE's measurement. So just as a reminder, CORE measures SEL for all students in the core districts in grades 4 through 12, has done that for 3 years. And in some of the districts, they also measure in 3rd grade. There's the primary use of these measures is that they are aggregated into a school level metric that's reported internally within the districts. Different districts manage that differently. So in some, all of the schools receive that data and use it. In some, it's actually publicly reported. But in all cases, it's designed as a school level metric and then broken out by subgroup. So when thinking about how these measures were designed, it's important to kind of go all the way back 4 years to how CORE organized around measuring SEL. We have a number of pieces through partners at Transforming Education, Taylor and Julie Marsh. Taylor, who was on the call earlier, is writing a piece right now about CORE's early decisions to measure SEL. But it's a very important process that they engaged in because they brought together people who sit at all places in the system, researchers, educators, measurement experts, and other stakeholders like parents and students themselves to talk about why would we measure SEL, what matters to us here, and how do we create an instrument that people agree with, and that kind of, not just that people agree with, but that represents the things that we want it to represent. And 3 of the things that came into play here were whether the measures were meaningful, do they reflect what we value, whether they're measurable, can we actually ask questions that get at this thing that we care about, and whether they're malleable. Because if something can't be moved, then it doesn't really make sense to measure it in a school performance measurement system, because then what does a school work on? So these kinds of things that Susan was talking about, where we say we want to move 20% more students to the next level. If the measures themselves don't move, then that doesn't help with that kind of goal setting. In the context of the development of the measures, there was pilot testing and item revision. And so this whole process of working with measurement experts and stakeholders really led to attacking a lot of these initial aspects of validity. So there were best practices in survey design. There was clear face validity because everybody who was going to use and interpret these measures believed that they were the things that needed to be measured. There's content validity because the right experts could look at these items and say, yes, this measures growth mindset. And the items were really representative of the constructs that they were hoping to introduce. Now, after the pilot year, CORE began implementing the survey at scale. And so it's with these at-scale administrations that we've then been able to do a lot of analysis as a measurement team to understand how these measures fit together and what they're related to. So on the topic of structural validity, we've done factor analysis that shows that the survey items do measure distinct and separate constructs. So what you see here is all of the items. And then the red ones are growth mindset, the green ones are self-efficacy, the blue ones are self-management, and the purple ones are social awareness. And what you're able to see visually is that the items do sort very cleanly on these different factors and do seem to be measuring 4 very distinct constructs. So it's not to say that these aren't related. They are related constructs and they correlate, some of them quite highly, but that the way that students are answering these questions hangs together in these factors. Students answer the growth mindset questions differently than they answer the self-efficacy questions. This is an important piece of structural validity. We also find that scale reliability is high, which provides an indication that the items do consistently measure the intended construct. And so what scale validity means is that all of the items that are embedded in that survey or that are part of that survey, students tend to answer them in the same way. So if there's 9 items on a survey, students that are high answer all 9 high, students that are low answer all 9 low, students anywhere in that distribution are answering similarly. But it's important to note what's happening here for growth mindset. This actually has much lower reliability. So if you read this graph, we look at many things in this work on grades because the grades function differently, as you'll see. And Crumbach's alpha has a score of 1 as a maximum. And 0.7 is typically considered to be the threshold for a well-functioning item with high scale reliability. And what we see is that in the lower grades, growth mindset is actually lower than that 0.7 threshold. And we have a few reasons why we think that could be true. And we're testing those as a research group. So in the early grades, it could be that the items are negatively phrased. And so the items are, many of the other items are positively phrased. I think I can. And some of these growth mindset items are, I think I can't. I don't think that my mind can grow. And in the early grades, that might be particularly difficult to interpret. And even in these upper grades, it could be difficult to interpret specifically for students who might not have very strong reading abilities or are still learning English. The other thing that's going on here with growth mindset is this scale has the lowest number of items, only 4 items, which just inherently produces lower scale reliability. So this is a place to be thinking about the trade-offs in measurement. So what are our outstanding questions in this area? We have some big questions about reliability across time. So if students were going to answer this question, these set of questions multiple times, would their responses be different? So would their responses be different depending on their mood? Yesterday I was in a good mood, so I was high on everything. Today I'm in a bad mood, so I'm low on everything. Or recent events. So before a big test, do they respond differently than after a big test? Do they respond differently depending on how well they think they did on the test? How stable are students' responses across time? And how different are students' responses if they're questioned at multiple points during the school year? So related to the first point I was making, in the fall, do students have really different responses than in the spring? And so these are questions that we really want to investigate over time and in partnership with the core districts. So the second question here, how well do CORE's measures fit the context? So the first area that I want to provide some evidence around is floor and ceiling effects. This is an important concern when we're working with survey metrics, because these are SEL questions on a 1 to 5 Likert scale. And this is not a scaled response like we do with SBAC, where there's a range of thousands of points. Really, students can answer on a 5-point scale. And so we do see that some of these items, this is just for an example, self-management in grade 8, we do see that some of the items are skewed. Coming prepared to class has some skew on this side. Some of them are more rounded, like paying attention isn't quite as skewed. But it's really important when we think about how to do this, that how we use these measures, that we eliminate some of this floor and ceiling effect. And so the measurement team has developed through item response theory methodology a measure that actually can smooth the data and that produces a more even distribution. So instead of just taking a raw mean, it weights all of the responses and says, this item has most students answer 5 on this one. So we're not going to give that as much weight as questions where there's more of a distribution. And this kind of measure creation actually can provide a much more valid measure that can be used. This is what we think of as kind of the gold standard. And as we'll talk about later, though, there are challenges and reasons why practitioners don't always want to use these measures, because you can't track them right back to a mean. So what you see here is a scale score that centers around 0. It's harder to explain to a teacher than the average student had a 4.1 on a 5-point scale. So measurement invariance, which means that students are interpreting and would not be interpreting and responding to questions in the same way, is a particularly important question when in the core data, because we see huge differences by gender. And so I'm going to take a minute on this chart to explain to you what we see here in the West et al. Paper that's posted on our website. There's a lot of graphs that show these trends by different groups. But I just picked one here to share with you, which is female versus male students. And so there's a lot to see here. This is how the mean score varies based on grade. So this shows grades 4 through 12, and then by different subgroups. So what you see is that there's a lot of difference between male and female students on all of these constructs. So with growth mindset, they're more similar. There's large gaps that are relatively consistent in self-management and social awareness. And then in self-efficacy, girls actually start higher than boys in grade 4, and then in grade 6 begin to dip down, and then have quite a growing and substantial gap through the middle and high school years. We also see substantial gaps by student subgroup. So this is from a different paper that I wrote with Dimitra Kalogridis and Susanna Loeb in 2017 that shows that even within the school, there are pretty substantial gaps by different student populations. So this is African American and white students. And so overall, we see a gap of about 0.35 standard deviations. If they were at 0, there would be no gap. Even within schools, African American students are significantly lower than white students in their SEL reports. We also see substantial subgroups between Latinx and white students, slightly smaller in Asian and white, and eligible for free and reduced price lunch versus not. And then back to very substantial gaps with our English learner students and students with disabilities. And so when we see these kinds of gaps, it's particularly important that this is real, that this is actually students understanding what they're reporting and reporting it, and not differences in interpretation. So one of the things that has come up in our work is that students, let's say female students, once they get to 6th grade, they understand the question of self-efficacy. They just don't want to say that they feel efficacious because being good in math is not cool. And that girls interpret that question differently than boys. We want to make sure that what's being reported is real and not false based on some kind of difference in interpretation. And so this is a hard question to get at, but our team has used an analysis called differential item functioning. And they've shown that at least within the constructs, the different subgroups are more or less responding to items in the same way. There are a couple of questions that do seem to have some measurement and variance issues, and the team is now working to correct those through a process of continuous improvement in measurement that we're engaged in with the core districts. But this provides some evidence that we don't have measurement and variance, at least at the item level. Another potential threat to validity is if students rate themselves differently relative to their peers. And so we have some evidence from a paper that Marty West did in 2016 that looked at the correlation between SEL and ELA. And the idea here is that if those things were related, so if students in high achieving schools rated themselves lower, then we would actually see a higher within school correlation than an overall correlation. And we see the opposite here, which provides some evidence that there is no reference bias in these SEL metrics. But we still have a lot of outstanding questions here. Primarily, we don't feel like we can entirely rule out yet that students from different cultural backgrounds or different races and ethnicities are answering the survey in the same way. And so there are tools that we can use here, not statistical tools as much as qualitative investigation tools. So cognitive interviewing is a way that people can address this concern. So you actually sit down with students of different backgrounds and say, tell me what you're thinking when you answer this question, as a way to start to understand the kinds of biases that might be in these metrics, either in terms of cultural reference or in language, and how that could be revised to eliminate that bias. We also have a question about students who don't speak English fluently. Are they able to interpret and respond to the SEL surveys as intended? And some of the gold standard in this area is actually kind of back and forth translation. And currently the core surveys don't do that. That might be an area where we could improve validity. And finally, do students in different grades interpret the items in the same way? So we see big differences by grade. And the way, as a research team, that we're handling that right now is that we look at each grade separately. But as we think about how students progress through the grades, we need to develop a better understanding about what's happening between 5th and 6th grade, for example. Is this an actual decline in social emotional learning, or is it an increase in cognitive processing ability where they're actually answering a different question than they were the year before? So these are some of the questions that we're continuing to investigate. On the topic of what level of fidelity CORE's data were acquired with, there's some pretty strong evidence here that the measures are valid and reliable in this domain. So in survey administration, CORE allowed for multiple modalities, paper and computer, and most of the districts work with an external provider. In many of the cases, this is Panorama Education, and they consolidate and share those responses. We also we have some evidence that satisficing isn't a huge and widespread problem. We have fairly high response rates, actually quite high for a survey like this. In most of the districts and schools, actually, the median is about 70%. And the missing item rates range from 1% to 7% per construct, with higher rates in the early grades, perhaps indicating some of the challenges in early grades interpretation. Now, to eliminate social desirability bias, student responses are kept confidential. That's something that the districts decided to do early and have continued to do. So this isn't intended for a teacher to see, oh, Johnny needs help on growth mindset. This is really intended to be aggregated at a school level and to be addressed at a school or grade level, team level. The demographic questions, when they're asked, are not asked until the end, so as to avoid issues around stereotype threat. And survey administrators stand at the back of the room so that they're not kind of hovering, and a student might say, I don't want my teacher to know I feel like I have low self-management skills, for example. But we still have a lot of questions here as well. Particularly around the amount of effort that students are putting into the surveys and the amount of truth that they're putting into the surveys. So some of the ways that we can address this are looking at some of these issues that I discussed earlier, like straight lining or mischievous responding. We also want to better understand whether students are giving socially desirable responses or reporting their actual perspectives. And here, a thing like an approach like cognitive interviewing can be really helpful here too. And then finally, it would be important to understand whether different survey administration procedures are more effective at getting good data, and if we can scale those administration procedures across sites. So the last topic here is around what extent CORE's measures are being used appropriately. So in the area of convergent validity, we have found that SEL is related to student, parent, and staff reports of school, culture, and climate. So this is one way of being able to see that SEL and culture climate are hypothesized to be related. We do see that in our data. We also see that students' SEL reports are related to their persistence on adaptive tests, and that students' SEL reports are highly correlated with teacher reports of the same student. So lots of things that we would expect to see related here are, in predictive validity, we have found that SEL is related, as we would expect it to be, in the direction we would expect it to be, to other academic and non-academic outcomes at the school level. And in some work that's currently ongoing now, we found that student level growth mindset reports are related to academic outcomes, but also growth in academic outcomes. And so this is some promising evidence that this isn't just kind of a proxy, but actually that moving these things will result in, moving SEL constructs will result in improvements in academics. In analysis and measurement creation, we've talked a bit about the work that the team has done to create a scale that is robust and that's more sophisticated and that actually eliminates some of the concerns around missing data or floor and ceiling effects. And we're also doing work right now to construct an SEL value added model. So instead of just saying, here's the school's report, actually saying, what is the school effect on growth in social emotional learning? And we've shown some promising results with just 2 years of data. We're now working to do this with a third year of data. But we see that there's variation in school effect on SEL, and that the school effects on each construct are related to each other and to academic outcomes. However, we also see that the model fit is weaker for academic outcomes, and there isn't as much across-school variation. In the area of consequential validity, this is an important one. Many folks think about CORE's metric as an accountability metric, which is how it was rolled out under the waiver, but it actually was never implemented in an accountability system. So there are things that we don't know from the CORE experience about what would change if these measures were included in a strict accountability system. We know from previous research that, and from talking with educators within CORE, that there are concerns around whether if there were stakes or teeth attached to these SEL metrics, concerns around gaming. They would be relatively easy to game. And the inclusion of them in systems that identify schools for improvement does pretty dramatically change the identification of schools. So 2 things we know from our research. But we also know that within CORE, introducing this survey and reporting the school metrics served as an intervention in and of itself. In our qualitative work, many educators told us that including SEL and school performance measurement system indicated to them that this matters. It gave them license to work on it in a way that they hadn't felt like they were able to before, with the strict focus on ELA and math achievement. And we also think that this focus at the district level and the reporting at the school level can contribute to higher response rates. So a lot of outstanding questions we have here. What's the school effect on SEL compared to the teacher or classroom effect? Do interventions that increase SEL lead to improvements in academic outcomes? Can what we learned from CORE be generalized outside of the CORE districts? And how short can the instruments be and still capture useful information? So just a couple of questions here that we provide for those considering SEL measurement or currently engaged in SEL measurement. First, what are you trying to accomplish through SEL measurement, and what constructs do your stakeholders really value most? What's your preference between simple metrics, which are easier to understand, and more sophisticated measures, which provide more information? What can you do to ensure or improve survey administration procedures to improve data quality? And finally, how can you ensure that the data will be used appropriately? In CORE, they have a saying that data should be used as a flashlight, not a hammer. So not to punish, but rather to illuminate. But that's an improvement mindset that has to be cultivated. And it's very important here that the measures are used to support and not to scapegoat vulnerable populations. So one of the concerns that comes out of this entire approach of work is that some of these gaps that we see, particularly with English language learner students, with African American students, their low responses are likely based in the larger system of inequality. And so how do we make these measures helpful and not another way that we disadvantage or marginalize these students? So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Barbara, who's going to provide some perspectives for us about what she's heard and how the work is playing out in her context.
Good morning. I'm from San Bernardino City Unified School District, and I am the Director of Accountability and Educational Technology. We have about 50,000 students in San Bernardino City, 74 schools, elementary, middle, and high schools. We're about 75% Latinx and 15% African American, with the remaining 10% a mixture of white, Pacific Islander, and Asian. A third of our students are English learners, and 90% of our students are low socioeconomic status. I think that in our district, one of the pieces that has been most encouraging has been the intentional and deliberate collaborative work across divisions and departments in response to what SEL learning has provided for us. So I'd like to share 4 areas for San Bernardino City that we feel are really highlight our work here in the district. The first is actually in measurement, and we feel that it's really important that we provide support for survey administration. And we've established site survey coordinators as point personnel at each one of our 74 schools. And during the actual administration of our surveys, we provide data to the sites to ensure that across the district, we reach a 95% participation level with our surveys. We've also established and trained as well as monitor district data protocols that help our teams look at the resulting survey data and use that data for analysis and action. So measurement being one of the areas, the other 3, training, implementation, and support directly to schools, come through our Student Wellness and Support Services Department with Rose Beaumentry and Colleen Williams leading the way. They've just done a tremendous job in marrying the SEL work with a grant opportunity, Learning Communities for School Success. And that grant opportunity has allowed them to establish site climate and culture teams at all of our 74 sites. At high schools, they have 4 culture and climate coaches. At middle schools, 3 coaches. At elementary, 2 coaches. And in our alternative settings, each school has a coach. Student Wellness and Support Services works in providing monthly training for the site culture and climate teams. And they have talked through and worked through accessing and analyzing the data from our surveys using the Panorama platform, also connecting the student data to action through the use of the Panorama playbook resources as well as purchase curriculum resources. Student Wellness and Support Services have also built just-in-time resources into our district learning management system to help support the implementation of SEL at school sites. So as you go into this virtual learning environment, there's activities like how to unpack the SEL standards, how to strengthen PBIS and restorative justice strategies, how to provide targeted supports for specific groups. So lots of work as we begin our SEL journey in San Bernardino City. I think some of the things that the research has provided, certainly is the idea that we want to facilitate opportunities for our school leaders to have discussions around the PACE research and encourage school leaders to then facilitate similar opportunities at a school level. The continuing work of our divisions and departments to intentionally and deliberately collaborate so we can provide better services to schools. And within that, we look forward as we're going to begin embedding SEL learning into the middle school English language arts curriculum as a start, and at the elementary level, embedding SEL learning into our early literacy initiative. Certainly, student wellness and support services, we want to continue to invest and strengthen in our professional learning opportunities in SEL, and one of the ways that we're doing this is piloting the use of calming centers to assist students in learning to manage their emotions. We're also working with our career technical education pathways and applied learning initiatives to provide additional curricular activities for students through internships and clubs on-site, and absolutely continue the support for measuring our culture and climate and our SEL, and to include that student voice in our measurement and our work. So just a quick synopsis of the things that we're working on in San Bernardino to move us forward.
Thank you so much, Barbara. And Christine, we're going to hand it over to you. And because we're running a little low on time, I'm going to give you a couple of the questions that have come up, and maybe you can address some of them in your comments too. There's questions around time, how you make time to make this happen at the school and district level, and also around staff capacity. How do you build that? And is there any pushback to both the time and capacity changes?
Yeah, so time and capacity are always resources that we're looking for, right? And so the best way to approach making sure that our educators are aware of social emotional learning and to embed it in the day. Some success that we found in working with some of our local districts is to really tie it to the California standards for the teaching profession. And really lifting out the standards and where social emotional learning is already embedded in their responsibility for what they're already having to do. And then looking to focus on a couple of those California standards for the teaching profession to then hone in on what are they going to do. So it might be creating inclusive environments, and that's what they're going to focus on as a goal. And then bringing that into professional learning communities to see if that's happening and giving each other strategies to do walkthroughs on campuses, making sure administrators are understanding what social emotional learning looks like in the classroom. So when we talk about time, it's making sure that we keep social emotional learning at the forefront as administrators, as our message for our staff about what we're expecting to see in the classroom.
Great. Thank you so much, Christine. So what we'll do, because we have just 1 minute left here, what we'll do for folks on the call who have some questions, we had some requests to send out a follow-up with the slides. I'll also provide all of the presenters' email addresses so you can contact anyone with follow-up questions. There's some specific requests for resources or how you did a particular thing. So we'll make sure that folks can connect on that, because that's really what we're trying to do here is to emphasize some of that cross-sharing. So presenters, anything that you would like to kind of reflect on as a parting comment? Noah, I'll call on you actually. Oh, looks like we might not have Noah.
Oh, I'm here.
Okay.
I just had to do the whole, unmute thing and that kind of thing. No, I think the range what we covered here speaks to the sort of the complexity and opportunity at play, which is we've seen just an ever-increasing focus on this issue. I actually really appreciate the point made at the end about how does this get ingrained into the work we're already doing? How does it lift it up? How does it make it smarter and better? I think that's something we heard throughout the findings as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Noah, and thank you to all of the panelists and to all of the attendees. Please make sure to check out the full reports. They really do have a lot more richness than we were able to provide today.